Whitman, Bonnie Sears, Bridget Powers, me, your acting chair, Chris Buckley, and Mary Ann Barnsley, and our Town of Plymouth staff, Brian Murphy. I guess the first thing we could do is review the minutes. Has everyone had a chance to look at those?
I found a couple of typos.
Throw them at us. What'd you find?
All right, page 2, number 5. In the 1, 2, 3, 4th line down, it says one abutter wants to butt it. I think that's supposed to be buy it.
Yeah.
Going back up to number 4, the project would be an increase of about 5,000 square feet. I think that's to about 5,000 square feet.
Okay.
It was about, that was,
Number 4.
okay. And that, we have a harder figure, it's lower than that.
I thought it was 57,
They present.
5,700 something from the plan that we got in the mail.
Right.
But I think it's not a 5,000 square foot increase is the point. It says it would be an increase of about 5,000 square feet.
Uh-huh.
It's making it sound like that's the amount of the change rather than the total square foot of the finished project, right?
Yes. So it's increasing by 5,000 square feet.
It's increasing.
Over the already approved number of X thousand square feet.
Okay,
It's an increase of about 5,000 square feet.
5,000 square feet more.
Yeah. As for the increase.
Oh, I thought it said it was increasing it by like 1,300 square feet from 4,000 something to 5,000 something
Oh.
from the original.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah. I was thinking of the other figure, yeah. I concur, up to would
Okay.
work in that.
And then at the very end, it's again Bonnie Spears who made a motion.
Yeah, I got that one too.
That
How's Brittany?
adjourned.
Just change your name.
Yeah, why not?
Is that it, Bridget?
That is all I had.
Anyone else?
Nope.
And the only thing I mean, there's a few typos, but I don't think they're worth going over. But in other comments on page 5, where Chris Buckley stated small things can be done, the last part of the sentence, then each member could take responsibility to focus on one portion. I didn't say that. I'm pretty sure. If I did, certainly didn't mean to, because that's not my feeling.
This is related to the master plan.
Related to the master
I think
plan.
Rebecca talked about each of us taking a section.
Yeah, and yeah, so
Should we,
I would strike that where from after material, put a period, and then just strike the rest of that sentence. And then each member could take responsibility to focus on one portion. Mostly because I'm not so sure that's a good idea, so. So I know it, I'm pretty sure I didn't say it, or I didn't mean to say that. Anything else in the minutes? Would anyone like to make a motion?
Yeah. I'd like to make a motion that we approve these minutes with the corrections on there.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved.
point of order, Mr. Chair, is Steve sitting?
Oh, Steve is sitting because there's, I'm sorry. Yeah, I meant to say that because we're,
I'll just mark that as seated instead of
Yes.
alternate.
yep. Thank you. Anything else? Procedural wise? Any comments from the public unrelated to tonight's agenda, which is a work session? I'm looking at you, Frank. Okay, so,
Before we get to the work session, can we make any comments from the board? Would that be all right?
sure.
Just because this is being televised, right? And a few questions have come my way. I don't know about the rest of you, but a few questions have come my way related to the zoning changes. And so I thought maybe just to clarify once again, if we could, if anyone's watching from home, that the changes that we were putting before the voters next week
Yes.
are things that have come up that have seemed to be issues that have created confusion or additional hoops for individuals to jump through that seem unnecessary. So they're largely administrative changes, is what I've been trying to share with people.
Okay.
I think regardless of how simple we've tried to keep it in our presentation at these meetings, it's easy for us, because of the terminology we have to use and because the process is hard to follow for people that don't know it, they quickly get confused about what we're talking about. And so if we can have a soundbite out there that these are administrative changes, we're hoping that people will follow our lead and support these changes for the good of future applicants. But if they are not passed, it doesn't really negatively impact the planning board. The emphasis is really on future applicants.
Correct.
And Steve, just for my clarification, these are those,
The commercial
emi-
co-location and.
yeah, okay, all right.
PBCAM has put up on one of their channels, not only, there's cards that detail them with a little bit of
Perfect.
stuff on there. And it's also up on the website now, but the website one includes the points of discussion, kind of the synopsis of who, what, and why
Okay.
that led to those amendments. So there's a little bit of the backgrounding. It talks about, how the commercial co-location thing is only going to matter, with, on one particular lot, but that's the only thing that changes is that you're allowed to have more than one primary structure as long as you meet everything else.
Right.
And then the successive one, same thing, if there's already one located on the lot. The only thing that we're leaving outside of the zoning ordinance is public safety that would be through fire department or the building office, as far as setbacks interior to the property.
So those descriptions are on the town website?
I believe so.
Okay.
I'll verify that. I think I sent it all up to Andrew,
Okay.
who could weigh in if he was paying attention.
'Cause we can just point people, if people ask questions over the next few days, at least we could point them to that
And they're
resource.
also down at the front desk. And nobody has asked me about them. Customers coming in have not asked me, so.
Well, that's good.
And are people asking you this because it was in that town report just came out with the warrant articles in the back?
Yeah, they're looking at it, trying to make sense of it. A couple people had said they specifically went back and actually looked at our planning board meetings, so they're doing their work.
Okay.
And they were really trying to make some sense out of it. And I tried to encourage them to take another look, but I explained from our perspective that not to overthink it, that
Yeah.
these really are administrative changes. It's really housekeeping more than anything.
Exactly. There's nothing really new.
Right.
It's just rearrangement of the existing parts.
At town meeting, will the planning board, will we be able to?
No,
this-
the day before.
That's the day before. This
Okay.
is at the ballot.
Okay, all right.
All right, thank
Brian, are
you.
you going to be there?
Town
Are
meeting?
you going to be there in case somebody asks a
Oh,
question?
voting day?
Yeah, I'll be at the table at town meeting, but it's already a done deal at that point.
No, I meant it when they go to vote.
I do go up there,
Yeah.
as a runner. but,
Yeah.
Certainly, if
So if
anybody
anybody has
there,
any
like, if
questions
you're
right
working the
then.
election and somebody asks, have them call up here, and I'd be more than happy to straighten them out.
Because, I can see where they look at that one about the indoor recreation, outdoor recreation, and I was looking at that saying, well, I really,
It's
to explain the
well,
whole history of it and right up to what you want to change, it's
That
like,
was probably the simplest, because it was a typo to begin with.
Really?
Well, I think, because it didn't really change anything there.
Right.
It shouldn't have been included in that category when it was first typed up.
Yeah, 'cause it was-
Because it's confusing, so now we're trying to make it less confusing, but like all things government,
It's confusing in the
it's
process.
confusing.
Right. Thank you for that, Chris.
Yeah.
Anything else from the board before we launch into the presentation, the continuing work on the master plan? And Steve, maybe you could tell us what we're
Sure.
I feel incredibly removed from this process.
Perfect.
And I got to say, the last meeting, it seems I'm a little bit. I mean, I really felt like there's a conversation going on that we're not part of. And the last meeting, including documents that we never received that were being discussed. So anyway, if you could sort of bring us up to speed in that, so we actually, I don't know about you guys, but so we feel actually included in this, because I feel like there's something going on that I don't.
All right, set all that aside. I was under the impression you guys got those documents. Rebecca's
did
been
finally,
through them. Just set that aside for now. So I met with Grace at the last meeting when I kind of asked Grace publicly, where she couldn't say no, if she would help facilitate this so that I could also participate, and we'll take turns so that she can participate as a property owner, but I can also participate as a property owner or a planning board member, and I don't dominate the conversation, was one of my goals. We spent about an hour or so the other day just thinking about all the various ways that we could do these work sessions and that we can make them engaging for the participants, and that we could start to go through a logical process that people could track, and that these conversations could hopefully lead to something fruitful, whatever that is. What we decided, I'm going to ask her in a moment to kind of share the ground rules, but we came up with a pretty simple scope for tonight just to get started. So I don't think you have to worry about any of that background information. If we come up with questions and we need to take a deeper look at the master plan or zoning, and we don't want to go too deep, we'll note those things so they can be revisited. But the idea is not to be flipping through lots of documents, if that helps. So I think maybe, Grace, if you want to start with kind of the ground rules for this session, just to make sure that we all have the same expectation for what we're going to get done. And Brian, you want to use this?
Sure.
I don't know if you want to use it or if you want it out of the way.
I think I want to use it.
Okay, cool.
I can hide behind
Never
it.
mind, Brian, I have a question.
And honestly, I'm only doing this with your blessing.
Well, it was
want
never
the help.
discussed. I mean, I think you brought it up, Steve, but it seems like it's a procedural thing that I mean, I'm willing to see how it goes.
It was discussed at the last meeting, and everyone said they wanted to have this type of a work session.
Well, this type of, okay, all right, but as far as,
Not the loop before, though, it sounded like.
yeah,
Only
I
things,
mean,
the things I shared before, it seems like you want to resolve that.
no, I'm just saying, as far as like I know it was mentioned to have a facilitator, but it was never explained like the role of the facilitator or why we would have one. Because that seems like the chair's job to me. But I mean, maybe you guys have cooked up something. So I mean, let's see what that is.
Well, at the last meeting in
I remember
February,
that came
when we
up,
brought it
yeah.
up, I suggested it so that we can't get this done in a year if it's just this planning board meeting once a month. It's impossible. And so I think that's a reality that everyone has to know. It's the gravity of taking on a rewriting of a zoning, even if we stay with a lot of the same standards and we try to streamline it and get rid of all the administrative issues and make it user-friendly. It's a huge task with an hour a month. And we've had some members of the public that have been willing to come forward because of Grace's experience as a facilitator. I thought if that would help so that the board can fully participate and the public can feel included to participate. That was all. So with that, we thought we should also be pretty clear about what we are doing and what we're not doing. And so Grace had an idea for how to kind of frame the evening that we wanted to run by you and see if that works. So that would be step one.
Okay.
Try that. And just say, we can just say how we do. And honestly, I don't mind taking a seat and having the chair do this too, and I can take notes.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
personally, I mean, as a landowner, property owner, this is great. I'm just excited that we're looking at the zoning and as many people as we can get involved in the public. I think it's going to be more from the public. I think it's going to be more, like Steve said, streamlined, and we're not going to get mired. But so, I mean, so one of the things I noticed when we work in groups like this is we kind of need something to focus on, particularly because we don't have a lot of time. So Steve and I just brainstormed a little bit and we put a few ideas down on paper. We can adopt them for the evening or not, or we could add to them, so that we don't get too lofty in what we're doing tonight.
Thank you.
I can surrender this if you want to have one. Here's another one, Grace, if you want. Got the other
Yes,
attendees.
sorry. Okay. Maybe you could share. So maybe the idea tonight would just really to be to look at this land use map and start within the village district and talk about, does this really reflect the aspects of the current zoning districts? And we can take some time to assess whether how they're drawn now help achieve the vision of the land use plan. Like, where are they compatible and where do they conflict? And that could be one place to put our energy. Thoughts?
Do you want to read through that mission piece to make sure that we're all on the same page?
Sure. And then the second thing we could do, and that's just be on this, and literally these are just sort of my hand scratch to try and see if we can form some consensus on what we want to do tonight. The second part would be, do we want to try and actually have a conversation about redefining or renaming zoning districts? That might be like kind of a loftier conversation that might take a long time over courses of weeks, but you could start that tonight if you feel like you get through the first part of this. I mean, do you need to add to or change zoning language so the zoning piece becomes more clear? The districts become more clear. I mean, I know, as you know, stepping into my landowner hat, just looking at the whole agricultural zone to me goes, whoa, it's just kind of catch-all. Like, personally, I've always thought it would be great to really break down that particular zone, for instance, and hone in a little bit more on it. That's just an example of what we could start talking about.
So we were given the form-based code and the transit-oriented development literature. So I'd be curious, because we happen to have your particular expertise. How does this fit into the conversation?
Do you want me to write up here?
Yeah.
Can I have a marker? What I would do is just flag, if we want to address those two issues, form-based code, and the transit-oriented development, these have some similarities, the TOD regulations. I would just ask the question so that we have a placeholder, which districts should those be considered for? And then kind of set it aside for now. And to explain the two, both of them promote mixed use, including mixed use within the building, so different uses on different floors. They both promote density, so a lot of uses closer together. Picture kind of the core of the village. And then this one, transit-oriented development, promotes that density with the thought that then you have transportation linkages. Like, it makes sense to have a shuttle there, or a bus going there, or a train, or something like that. So if those were options that could be considered in the future, which areas of the community would that make sense?
And then also, because I'm new procedurally, I'm curious to know what the process looks like in terms of a time frame. And for instance, we're putting before the voters these recommended zoning changes. Is this is the intention, or is this what you're talking about being feasible to do in a year? We're talking about changing these zoning regulations and putting what we're talking about now up for next year's vote? Is that the idea?
It's the soonest.
Yeah, I mean, timeframe wise, Steve's correct. If the discussion leads to the point where there could be an actual amendment come the fall, there's no reason not to pursue it.
So Steve,
If the board wills.
is that a hypothetical about where this,
Just because I wanted to address Bridget's question, just hypothetically, yes. If we're going to revisit these at some point, because right now they're kind of a distraction. So if we're going to revisit them, where in town do we foresee density, transportation options, mix of use? Do you have ideas where that could be? Anyone?
oh, yeah, but, I mean, it's certainly like the agricultural zone wouldn't be a place to have
Right. So where-
transportation. I
so
think
where
those are
would-
pretty obvious, and that would be, the immediate downtown area and connect it to Tenny Mountain, the commercial zones.
The village and commercial zone? That makes sense to me, Chris. I just don't want to assume anything is obvious because we want to make sure we carry everybody along, I think, in the conversation, including people that are watching. So I would agree that those would be the two logical places that we could come back to with that. But for now, I would not get hung up on those. I would kind of go back to where Grace was and make sure that the idea between the mission statement here is that we stay focused on thinking about the zoning and kind of big picture right now, and that we don't get into really specific things about specific setbacks or specific issues with a one particular property, that type of stuff.
And what would fit with both of those would be an overlay along the state highways.
Okay.
You know, similar, whether it's, numbers of feet or particular to a neighborhood.
Yep.
So you're talking about real specific things?
No, just as a big sense. I mean, if it's form-based and it's transit-oriented, then where's the transit? It's state highways. I mean,
Right. Okay. So we'll keep, our thought, Brian, for this was we can keep notes from these sessions, type them up and send them to you to include in the minutes, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It doesn't present you with another thing to do on top of it.
Oh, come on.
But I think before we get sidetracked by this, unfortunately, we've gone in a couple different directions before tonight, and I'd like to kind of reel it back to the real basic part. And I don't want to ignore your question, Frank, but if you could be patient. Anything else on the statement that you handed out? I feel like I don't want to brush over it.
Well, I mean, we could just look at that. I think the idea tonight would just be kind of to look at where we are with zoning. To look at the land use map and see if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And look at the zones and see if those make sense. And then to really kind of drill down at some point and look at what the characteristics of each area is.
So district, name, district location,
Yep.
and characteristics.
And Steve and I were kind of talking about maybe it makes sense to look at the village district because that's almost easier.
Is that fair? Start there and kind of work our way out?
Sure.
Okay.
So there it is in red. Does this like clear as mud? Because I'm a little fuzzy too.
Well, I think one thing, and this is what I mean by feeling kind of left out, one thing that would really have helped is if we got like this agenda ahead of time so we could have thought about it and kind of figured out, okay, what are we doing tonight? And come in, so you're going to ask us questions that we haven't really had a chance to think about too much.
We started this last month. I feel like last month we did half of this. We started with the village. We talked about the village in very general terms. Does it make sense? Are there issues or opportunities? What are its characteristics? We're just continuing that conversation.
Right.
But if we don't start now, we'll never
Yeah.
get anywhere.
So I think Frank, during our last meeting,
Yeah.
talked about some real problems with the village zoning that there's several little, especially on, I think, Green Street, where several little slivers of, there's an piece of agricultural land down there.
Okay.
That seems like and there were several things, and maybe Frank, you could elaborate on that, but those things seem like they'd be no-brainers to clean up, because that seems like it definitely, when Frank explained that, like, that's a problem.
Yep.
So they're actually part of the zoning districts, the little slivers?
Yeah, but right there, you can see in the red is the
Yep.
village commercial.
Yep.
Just to the right of it is a white swath between that and the river.
Yep.
That's agricultural zone.
Yep.
So essentially, the zones were drawn up around existing patterns. There was nothing happening down there when that zone was left as agricultural. The courthouse wasn't there.
Sure.
Um,
It's a great time for this kind of conversation.
That's a perfect example of the type of thing we want to highlight but not solve tonight. Like, we want to have that as something that we can come back to as we have a fuller picture of the district. But that's perfect.
So
We got Frank worked up because now he really wants to say something.
why don't you go ahead, Frank?
Well, what I'd like to say is, first of all, our zoning, as we see it there, is reflective of the 1960s. And all our methodologies of zoning are from the 30s and 40s. Unfortunately, a lot of things have changed. And to help us out here, I think the Office of State Planning has a copy of all of the zones, all cities in the state of New Hampshire. And they have gone through various change over the years of labeling specifically the agricultural elements and coming up with unique names of zones that reflect the use of that type of real estate. So rather than us sitting here trying to reinvent a wheel, is to get that inventory so that we then have a tool to evaluate our existing lands and our zones that go with it to see if we need to change some of our labels and definitions of their use in there. And then, of course, we also need to reevaluate our specific boundaries that reflect the current land use as it is viewed and being done today, rather than something that's from 1961.
Well, so I think that's why we're here.
Yeah, I agree with you in philosophy. I don't agree with you in order. Because what the Office of Strategic Initiatives now has does not have the context of place. And so what we want to do is start with the reality of what we know about these places and talk about issues like the fact that, you know, what we define as the village maybe has other land use zones in it, and kind of talk about that in broader terms and identify what we really like that's working that we do not want to mess with, and then what needs to be resolved. And that may result in us having to look at that resource, but we're trying to make sure it's definitely Plymouth place-based, not based on old land use patterns, really reinforcing the master plan.
Yeah.
That's all.
So I think, Frank, your takeaway message is, you know, this is an old plan, it was created a long time ago, and it's kind of time for some kind of visioning like this, and we have resources. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay.
What else about the village district? Just, this is a brainstorming. You're not held to any of these things. This is a work session, so it can be free form, and we just want to hear from you.
Are you talking about uses, or are we talking, what is the content?
It could be anything about the boundaries of it, issues within it, uses that make sense or don't make sense, opportunities. We're trying to understand the characteristics of, should we get rid of the village district? Should we keep it exactly the way it is? Is there a middle ground where there's a little bit of change?
We have already expanded it once.
Have we?
Yes.
Okay. Where did we expand to, Brian?
Good
Well,
job.
actually, no, we limited it at Merrill Street. It used to extend up almost to the river,
Okay.
and we realized that wasn't really the village or the downtown area where most of the zoning stuff, it didn't really apply past that.
Right.
You know, if you wanted to keep, and that goes back to the density factor, because obviously the uses in the highway commercial are different than they are downtown. Plus, the land use in the village district is the least restrictive, you know, setback wise and parking wise and things like that, which is recognizing the ground state, but also if that feeds back to the density and walkability of the downtown. So, you know, if it gets developed to the armory, say, you know, and that comes into play, then we can look again and re-overlay that with village commercial. But at this point, it opened it up for other uses, and it wasn't as restrictive restrictive in some ways, but not so in others.
Got it.
And it's patently obvious to anybody who reads our zoning that this is reactive, and it's mostly based on housing. So if we could look beyond those parameters, you know.
In the village district as well, or just in general?
Well, general to start, and then it was reflected in the village district by restricting ground floor residences.
Tell me more about that.
So you couldn't have ground floor residences
In the village commercial district today.
Got it.
Right. Do you think that's something we should retain, or you say?
I think we absolutely need to retain it just to keep the downtown flavor going.
Right, I would agree.
And it ends up looking more like the European model than
Nodding too.
the 20th century American model, if you want to look at that, where you
What
have
do
the
you-
downtown and the residences out here.
So since it was narrowed, if you will, the village district, do you think it's sort of reflective of the land use? And does it match the plan at this, you know, the way,
Master plan.
the master plan?
I think it does.
Your current master plan that you adopted?
You know, because again, if we're centrally locating things,
Yep.
it goes back to all the other, the form-based and the transit-based stuff. I mean, it all feeds into each other. The walkability, which is a great term, because, people are actually seeking that today. And I think that also, as a population, we're more physical than at the time when this was written.
Okay, so I want to follow that line of thinking, and I want to put some things up here, but I want you to stop me if I go too far. So, and I'm going to throw some of Frank's favorites up here. But thinking about the pattern of development that you just talked about and the walkability of it, to me, the village is a higher density of uses, right? It's non-residential on the first floor, so it's the highest density location we have in town as far as use, right? And I think we want to keep it that way, correct? So it's high density. It has infrastructure in the sense of water and sewer and transportation. So it has infrastructure.
Has most of the sidewalks in as well.
Has most sidewalks, but maybe not all, right? But it has challenges as well. So I think of Frank's comments on parking, stormwater. There are some infrastructure challenges as well. And we don't have to solve them tonight, but I think we can acknowledge them. Is
Can
that
those be
fair?
solved through zoning? Some of those
They
problems?
should at least be considered, and they can be encouraged to be solved as development happens, yeah. But they're also non-regulatory things we could be doing, but it costs money, and none of us are fans of
The
that.
solution to those things that were just named would be helped immensely if we would take that area between the railroad tracks and Green Street essentially and relabel that as Village Commercial Zone. Mainly because we're trying to connect the road from Route 3 to Green Street, which has been on our plan now for 30-some years. Our sidewalks on Green Street from various projects have what you call incompletes. You've got a sidewalk that's 500 feet long and then stops and there's no sidewalk. Our plan for the Green Street Riverfront Park system we've hoped for is incomplete. And trying to do all of these programs that we have in our master plan with multiple zones makes it very confusing, even for the board members and planners to get through, whereas if it was all village commercial zone, recognizing it represents the core of the downtown area.
So Frank, you would expand that village district almost to the river
Yeah.
This piece
and get rid of that
Go back in
agriculture.
here, Frank, right?
Right.
That's your
correct.
suggestion.
Can anybody envision any other reason to expand the district beyond that? I can't think of
Well,
one.
there's
I
a
just
river
wanna ask.
there and it's no longer our property.
No, I think he means either,
North, south, or west?
yeah.
Well, no, that would be I think if we're gonna keep it a village commercial zone, and any parts past Parker Street, that area from Parker Street north needs to be village commercial
Right.
zone. Because that is a contiguous piece of property that needs to be redeveloped.
You're saying from Parker Street,
Yeah.
this part should be village commercial?
No, on the river bank.
On the right-hand
Oh, just from here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, so all that property is one piece of property. Well, it's part of the state board park, but it's also a piece of property that has, just by nothing been done to it, has great potential for development of housing, like a senior housing complex, along with environmental mitigation of a piece of property of about 9 acres that has just been ignored. And so when that was laid out back in 1800s and all of the work that's been done with Route 3, they didn't do environmental mitigation, drainage programs, or any other issues.
Can we table that issue right now?
Yes.
So is that cool?
As a concept.
Okay.
So just that area of Green Street that's up there, if that went to village commercial zone,
Okay, we got
that
it.
would be
I think we
big
captured it.
start.
Anybody else about this village?
I think that makes sense myself, to have that all because that's where it is. What else, what do you, why keep it agricultural? We got a lot of that.
And is the sewer, waste treatment in that?
Yes, it is. It's at the very south end,
Yeah, got it.
A lot of
Chris,
floodplain.
you, yep.
right?
So I could think of, and I can't, no specifics here, but I could think of one reason that the type of thing that we might want to expand our village commercial zone would be, and this is a total for instance.
Yeah.
And this would also include the transit-based
Okay.
development and parking. If, because it's tough to find a parking place, like a place for, say, a parking garage or an additional parking lot. If we identified some place outside of this zone, and could connect that with, in the transportation hub,
Walking path.
that might be something, as we work our way through the master plan and we start thinking about parking and how to solve parking problems, and think about connecting transportation and connectivity, to at least be open for identifying.
There should be an intermodal
Location.
transportation interconnect.
Okay, hold on, I just want to make sure Chris is done.
Oh,
Sorry.
Does that make sense, what
Yep.
I'm saying?
So so let me just see if I can make sure. So if there was a parking garage, you'd include that also?
Well, what I'm saying is, we may not find, within this commercial, within the village commercial zone, there may not be a good location to solve our parking problem. So we might want to be open to, not, it would have to be close.
Yes.
Of course, right.
And it would have to be connected, because if we're going to park there, we're going to want to be able to get into town. But that would be something I think we should think about as we go through, it is a problem we need to solve. And as we go through the master plan and the zoning, to think about that.
It's a very linear zone, and it's bounded by a geographic feature and a built environment
Right,
to the west.
absolutely.
So the only place to get that is that one little space that we have available to us to the river, and north or south of there, as far as a satellite parking facility.
And that's what I kind of envisioned, to the north somewhere.
If we
Yeah,
can just
the-
table
like the
that, that one
McDonald's
issue
lot, for
now.
example.
So, but you captured it.
I captured it. So what's exciting about just that little bit that we got about the village district is it gives us enough to know the boundary has to change. Like we would advocate for a boundary change tonight. We can revisit that and see if it still makes sense. That overall, we really like that district for what it has. We recognize some of its assets, we recognize some of its limitations. The reason I kind of give that overview is one of the things I suggested to Grace that I wanted to ask you tonight is, as we go through this process, what I don't want to feel like you or the public have to do is start over again next month, start over again in May, start over again in June. So as we get some clarity on a district, my recommendation would be, and I'm happy to donate time to do this, we create a summary sheet for each district. That's just a template, and that starts to fill in what we know and questions we have. And what I'd like to get us to is a place where we have a purpose statement for the districts. The master plan will help us with that, and then this process will help. So we can have the district name, the purpose statement, the dimensional standards as they are now, and we can revisit if they need changes, the uses as they are now, and we can revisit those if they need changes. And ultimately, when we get through this process, if it works, if we can get some consensus on what those districts look like, and if there are changes, what they are, and how the map changes, then we have something that people can understand, I think. They can go to their district of choice, they can see what the standards are, we can even do a side-by-side. Here's the old standard and a new standard if there's a change. And we don't have to be giving people volumes of legalese to read through and try to make sense of it. Does that seem like a fair approach to try to
To nail
take,
some of this down,
Yep.
summarize it.
and that all stays draft as we go through this? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel some of this is out of my expertise, which is why I think it's great that people who do have expertise are working on it. And certainly when it comes down to making some real decisions, we would have to weigh in on that with your explanation. So I'm like, a lot of this detail.
We have a master plan behind it. I mean, that's the reality. We're implementing the master plan. And where we don't agree with something that's in the master plan, or the public doesn't agree, we can talk about it. But we're not starting from zero. We're starting from 2 years worth of master plan discussions about all these districts. So that gives us a place to look and say, well, we found it in the master plan. Does this still make sense? Or, hey, we didn't find it in the master plan. Could we have a conversation about it? And so I think the fact that you're willing as a planning board member to help make these sessions happen and you're not 100% comfortable with it is important, because there aren't a lot of people here tonight because they feel the same.
Yeah.
You know,
There's a lot of
it is daunting.
kind of terminology heavy.
Yes.
But by going through it like this, we're kind of converting it into common parlance, which I think is key.
Yep.
And the fact that we all live here, we've seen all this stuff. The more input we get about the pros and the cons of each district, and it's just going on a list, to be winnowed down later.
Exactly. And we don't have to be the only experts. And I would say an example would be in some of these other districts, there may be other stakeholders we want to reach out to. And one of them is the multifamily residential. We might want to talk about what we think about it, but then we might want to reach out to some of those landlords and say, does this still make sense? How is it working for you? What do you envision in the future as things change and are changing?
There are changes coming down that are out of our control.
Exactly, absolutely. And that already don't gel with our master plan.
Correct.
Is it okay? Are you okay with if we stop with the village for now, knowing that we've gotten started on it, and we're going to have a basis?
Yeah, and I'm actually kind of wondering if we should go to the multi.
I think we should.
Can I ask a question? So I'm just sitting here trying to learn, still as a newbie. I'm gonna claim that now. So this is the piece of the master plan called land use, yes?
No, this is zoning.
Zoning, sorry. So have we decided, because it'll take so long, that the zoning piece is what we're gonna be looking at from the master plan perspective? Because there's all these other pieces as well.
And those don't need to stop being worked on, but because this takes process and because it has to get voted on by the public, and it's only, you get one shot a year to do that, we want.
So this is the only piece that gets one shot or has to be voted on?
Right.
Okay.
Anything that's regulatory in nature from zoning, the subdivision regs and site plan regs and non-regulatory stuff we can do at regular meetings and special hearings.
Okay.
And I think that once we have the conversation about the individual zones, and we're pretty close to knocking off 2 tonight.
Right.
So it shrinks our time frame.
It does.
And then, once we get all this, we can look at it on the big picture with all the varying pros and cons for each one, and see if there's, any connection between the two, if it's worthwhile to expand one way or shrink the other, or open it up for another use, or restrict uses. But, essentially, I think we got to define what it is we're talking about first. And
Giving us a
that's
starting
what's
point.
happening.
So can you help us, Brian, just sort of define the edges of the multi-family residential, unless nobody feels like you need to do that?
Okay, there are 2.
And we can use this as, I see 3 of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there are 3.
Oh,
Hey, go
you
ahead.
see
See
that?
that thing?
So
You took them away.
Yeah, I can see it.
I can
this
see
is
9.
just like
Yeah.
46.
I didn't realize that one.
This is just one item, I think, to answer part of your question.
But it's a
in the
big
master
item.
plan.
Yeah.
In one section. It is item 1 in the land use is to correct zoning maps, and so in the big picture, we're talking about this one thing.
Right.
From what I've learned by being here and working this, those zones were an attempt to sequester conversion of single-family homes into multifamilies.
Okay, got it.
Contain that pattern.
Yes,
Okay.
And has that worked?
essentially, it does. I mean, the people can still expand or contract through variances or special exceptions. They are very proximate to the university, which is why they were, valuable to the private enterprise people. And, they brought their own problems. Of course, it was kind of the Wild West back in the 70s and 80s. There were a lot of single-family homes were converted to multifamilies with no occupancy caps. So the folks that were still in the neighborhoods at the time wanted to stop that. And, it's kind of like we're trying to go back the other direction, even though it's not, because we're recognizing that residential neighborhoods are a completely different kettle of fish than the commercial or the agricultural stuff that we're looking at.
So if I can, is it okay to kind of guide you along into?
Don't put words in my mouth, that's all I ask.
Got it. No, what I'm trying to do is like
Yes.
corral you into, can you talk about where those exact zones begin and end, or do we all know? Because I see three.
Yes,
I can point for you, and you correct me, this is Russell Street, correct?
yes,
So
Russell
Street's
Winter.
the center of
Thank
that
you.
district, right?
Yeah.
In Winter?
This is just.
Yeah,
for
they're
everything.
kind of in there together.
Winter's on the outside of that district, the west side of that district,
Yes,
is that correct? And it goes all the way up, basically just shy of Highland Street, it looks like.
yes.
And then this one has Langdon Street kind of up the middle. Langdon Street's here, right?
Right, Edmonds Court,
Is that Edmonds Court?
yeah, I think so.
And it goes all the way up. Where does it go? It goes
Does it go
past
to-
Merrill? Is this
There's
Merrill?
nothing beyond Merrill for the town.
It almost looks like it's gone too far.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
may have included the dorms,
Oh,
Okay.
okay, interesting, okay.
even though it shouldn't be there.
Right.
And then there was that one little section well to the north, which would be on the northern side of the university
Is that
property.
North Main Street? Old Route 3, like, is that what that is, or not?
No, they're right on the river.
This up here?
No, the Old North Main Street is right on the Baker.
Okay, got it.
So what is that one area there?
So is that near,
Yeah,
beyond
maybe that map's
Irving,
better.
beyond Irving Station?
Oh, yeah, it's the neighborhood,
Used to be owned
probably
by-
defined by Pearl, Merrill, and the parallel street that runs, and whose name escapes me now, that runs behind the Irving Station.
Is that
Right.
George
Oh,
used to?
is that Wheat Street?
Weeks, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
So it's
So-
just that one little block in
Does
there.
that seem representative still of the land use today, or has that expanded or contracted?
It's expanded in intensity, but not in footprint.
Got it. Anybody else feel any different?
When we're talking multifamily, we're talking,
Anything two-family or up.
and really, it sounds like, I don't think that was the original intent, but what we're describing is where the college.
Well, that was the
Correct.
intent to contain that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
There are multifamily homes on Highland Street and sprinkling of
There's one on
others.
Texas Hill Road, right near,
yep,
Right.
Yep.
near Bryan.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that you couldn't have a multifamily
Correct.
elsewhere, but there was something different about that pattern that they wanted to
they
contain.
wanted to protect the single-family neighborhoods.
And what I like about it, as somebody, this was a pre-existing condition for me, right? As a planner, I like seeing the density of the village for all the things we talked about. And then the first residential area you get to is this higher density area. Now, of course, we're a university town, it makes sense that that's primarily where students are living and they can walk to campus. I think we can't get too fixated on who's living in the units or who's renting the units. We have to really focus on the pattern and the use as a rental or as a owned home or whatever. And whether off-campus landlords decide to rent to young professionals or seniors or whatever, I don't know, do we care?
No,
We're not gonna regulate that.
I mean, administratively, we look at numbers, not who they are.
Sure.
And I think the goal, like, I know there's also some multifamily out on Fairgrounds, right?
Absolutely, but those are allowed in those zones. See, so what they did was, they took the ones that were already in use and drew the zone lines around them.
Would it
And then they
make,
put in the qualifications for building those outside of the, I mean, those are surrounded by single-family
So
zone.
they were existing, and we said, okay, here's the footprint, and let's not infringe on the single-family homes
Correct.
anymore. We're gonna define them, and we're gonna say they're okay, but we're not gonna grow them.
and for accuracy's sake, would it make more sense, rather than call this multifamily, which it really isn't, to call it like high-density residential, something like that?
Could. That's on, I mean, let's just list that. That's.
I mean, it's not a big deal, but it's just
Sure.
more
Descriptive.
descriptive of what it actually
We're
is.
just
Sure.
collecting all kinds of
But,
ideas.
you know, we're talking apples and oranges. So, yeah, you have two-family homes, and they have a higher density because there's twice as many people on the same lot for the two families. So, you know, it is higher density because of the way they were built and used up until the zone lines were drawn. And it's all, this was an overlay, I mean, zoning didn't come into Plymouth until the 1960s, and we're over 250 years old. So, you know, the development patterns were there, and then when it became an issue and zoning was brought in, then they drew those lines to protect those neighborhoods.
This,
So talk about, oh, go ahead.
this piece that Chris just brought up though,
Yeah.
it could at some point become the name of the district. It could be used in the purpose statement.
To
It
help
could-
define it.
Exactly. I mean, if we decide at some point, if the agricultural district became more than one district, and all of a sudden we have to rename single-family residential, it could be single-family village residential or whatever. High-density village residential. Or there could be, we don't know where this is going, so I think just getting it down and having it part of the conversation, and then we can always cast it off if it doesn't get needed.
And just to go with what Steve was saying, it's typical elsewhere that they have these zones broken down into, you know, 2 or more, you know, residential 1, residential 2, and, you know, light commercial, heavy commercial, that, but it's all subsets of the zones that we have. So, I mean, you know, if it finds that we need to break it down further, we're not precluded from doing that. We're just essentially identifying the ground state at this point, I think.
Anything else about the multifamily piece? And I'm so sorry I have my back to you.
Typically, they're older buildings. I don't know if that comes into play at all.
Well, I think it does in the sense that when we look at the standards as they exist now, we should consider if any of those buildings were removed and we saw new buildings go up like we have seen on Green Street, what kind of standard would we want to encourage or require? And one of the reasons to think about that is if there were to be a trend of less opportunity to rent to students off campus, and landlords would want to explore other options to either retirees or empty nesters or whatever the case may be, let's at least give them some guidance of what we'd like to see so that they can have success in putting a project together. So.
I'm stuck on a little piece, just want to ask Brian something. So are you saying this part of the zone kind of goes too far north?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Revisit-
Bailey
Yeah,
Avenue there.
revisit the boundary, the actual
Langley
northern
Street.
boundary.
But I don't think it shows on this map.
Oh, yeah, I think this is almost too.
So here's the MFR, the little
you.
satellite piece.
Okay.
There's that one, so it goes,
Is that the one we're looking at?
yeah, it goes beyond Merrill, but when you go past Merrill and Langdon, that's university property. So I think that they just put that in. It might have been there prior to them acquiring that property and putting up those domes.
Sure. I mean, it could be a way to refine this to put it into civic institutional if it indeed needs to be there, or leave it where it is. But that's one thing we can.
We can just check
yeah.
that.
Does that make sense?
Awesome.
What time are you trying to finish up tonight?
I have till midnight. And the students have to stay.
Do you want to include there your idea about keeping in mind considerations for standards for new building?
Yeah, let's
Thank
do
you.
that.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
I'll just add as a question, Mark. You
It's better handwriting than I do, by the way.
really? It's the first time I've ever heard that.
Look at my scribble. I got a red F and penmanship in like second grade.
Of course, since most of those buildings are pre-existing non-conforming,
Right.
any new building or replacement building would be to today's zoning, so it kind of answers itself.
But we should make sure that
Many ways.
the standard they'd have to meet is one we think makes sense.
Right, oh, no, exactly. I mean, you know, but if we're just arguing from what we have in the book today, then yeah, it would be a completely different landscape than what you see, because there would be parking, there would be setbacks, there would be,
Right.
you know, and it would look completely different than it does.
Yep, absolutely.
Do you want to tackle one more?
I think we should do the famous civic institutional.
Do you want to do that or the little one? I was sort of gravitating towards the highway commercial because I think.
I just don't want to leave the village with that pink piece separate into two.
All right, let's
districts.
do it. Everybody good to go?
I'm assuming it'll be an easy one, and I would probably be wrong.
Civic institutional? Is the way it's drawn representative of the land use?
It was drawn because of the land use.
I had that question too, so can I just get, I want to make sure I'm looking at it correctly.
This is helpful to have you here.
This is the common, so the common, the eastern boundary of the common, Main Street, becomes the eastern boundary of this district, is my understanding, right? And then it goes across, it does include at least one private building, the one next to the church. Right? So between the church and the post office?
Oh, right.
Yes.
The old hairdresser's place,
Yeah,
it's an apartment building now.
It's
Yeah.
off-campus rentals.
Yep.
Doug McLean.
No, I'm thinking
No,
actually, that one too.
Wilson's Jewelers.
That one
Yes,
too,
the
Wilson's
Jewelers.
But it also includes Doug
Right.
McLean, you're right. It has that too.
So I'm kind of wondering, why wouldn't that be a village district, just as a putting on my.
Yeah.
And there's no reason not to have a town hall and a church and a post office as part of your village. So I don't know if that makes sense to at some point bring those into the village district. Because they could get redeveloped at some point. Hopefully not this building.
And
none of
actually,
them might,
and you're saying the commons in there too?
The common, yeah. Is in civic institutional.
The Silver Hall is in the village commercial zone.
Right.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
That's a good point.
That was because when they built that, they took the property that was previously there, which was part of the civic institution, of course, and built the Silver Hall. So that's what has happened with the acquisitions and change of use, change of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that confuses people is your historic district overlay. Okay, so, some of the, like the town hall.
Well, we don't have a
We don't
historic
have
district
one.
from a zoning perspective. There's no
Correct.
historic district. So if we could set that aside, we should try to address it at some point if it's
Right.
confusing people.
But your Silver Hall, the Silver Hall is in the village commercial zone. And now we're talking about use versus ownership,
Mm-hmm.
because its use represents a commercial activity application.
Right.
And so if you took the word commercial, the post office is a commercial event, even though it's federally owned. And it's a civic ownership, but its element is commercial activity. So that's something that, one of the things we need to help us address is the descriptionary of the terms that we use in addressing some of these zones.
Got it.
And that's the confusing part between the professional of a board man, planning boards and select boards, and then obviously the citizens of the town.
So this district, right now, civic and institutional, includes a bunch of things that are not civic or institutional. And Frank's pointing out the village also includes some things that are civic or institutional.
So it seems like the question is it mapped by ownership or by use?
Well, I guess my question for Brian is, the standards for civic and institutional, are they really different than village or any of the other districts?
Only that it allows things like the hospital and the museums and, that type of thing.
But would we not allow those in a village?
Probably not. I didn't bring my zoning ordinance with me.
No,
The
that's
table
fine.
of uses speaks directly to that. But again, we're ignoring history here. So the preponderance of uses in that little bump out that we're talking about
In here?
are civic.
Right.
Some have commercial aspects. But, so they took the biggest players in there. So it's town hall and the historical society and the library. So, and the university, of course, and the hospital, some of the professional places along there all fall into that zone. And of course, there's always outliers just because of the way the zoning was developed. It doesn't preclude those uses, I don't believe, other than, for example, you could have a residence there, and I'm going from memory, so please don't hold me to this.
In the civic.
But, it could be that you recognize that, that's an appropriate mixed use. Nor I mean, there's attorneys' offices along there. Many of them reside there, you know. So that they'd already set the pattern for mixed use along there.
Can I ask a bold question, though? So my bold question would, and maybe we can't resolve it tonight, would be, do we need to keep the civic and institutional district? And if so, do we change its boundaries? Like, can we revisit it and know that it still has a purpose, or can it be reconfigured? And the reason I ask that is we've already identified some challenges around its edges. Mm-hmm. And then in the master plan, we also identified Highland Street as something that has to be addressed.
Yeah, no, that would be the logical expansion point for
Highland
the
Street?
civic institutional.
Or for the village.
I think Steve is.
Well, it butts right up against single family
So does
once
the,
you get further up.
so does the
If the village commercial went up Highland.
right. And I'm trying to settle this tonight. I'm just trying
Right.
to see if any of these things should be further.
You know,
vetted.
it looked at, like in the past, again, you know, if we could plumb the minds of the founders, you know, what were you thinking? You know, and I think they were saying, okay, this is the most types of things that we have going on here. We'll call it this. We'll kind of make it easy for further ones to come in that regard. You know, because they didn't just say, you know, we'd like to see this here. You know, Highland Street used to be the highway, and now it's a single-family zone. So, you know, that's kind of different, you know, in certain places. But that was based on the development along there.
I just find this third district that we're looking at so much less consistent with the pattern than the other two were.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. I'm just trying to flag. This is our opportunity where we don't have to worry about the history of how we got to this map, and we can really think, does it still work for us? Does it make sense?
Yeah, and
I think to answer your question, the best way to do this unemotionally is analytics between writing out what's allowed in those particular zones
Yep.
and what unique controlling specifications for application of use in those zones.
so we're talking about characteristics.
Side by side.
land.
And that way, you'll know where the conflicts are gonna be for any changes.
Anybody else feel the same way about this village district / civil institutional and how they butt up against each other?
Well, I think one of the things we might think of, what could go wrong? Like, if we combine those two districts, what might bump up against single family that we wouldn't want to happen? Because I'll tell you, some of the most interesting places that I've ever visited, you know, and I think of just about any place in Labrador, or Aruba is another place I went where they really have no zoning. And I found that really refreshing, like really kind of nice. Stuff is like, for no rhyme or reason, you find things. Now, they don't have heavy industry. That would be a very different story. Right. But, you know, to find like in the middle of a residential neighborhood, just a store, like the old corner stores, or a restaurant, or, you know, anything that could pop up.
It can go both ways, though. It can go good and it can go bad.
Yeah, and that's what I wonder. That's what I'm thinking. Like, can we think ahead to, like, what could go bad? Like, if we...
What would you not want to live next to?
Yeah, exactly.
But because this is called civic and institutional, we still have uses that are not civic or institutional. I like Frank's idea. If we can look at the uses that are allowed, look at the uses that are there,
How they're defined.
and how it's defined, and see, should we retain it? Does it still have a function?
And the reason that zone is so big is it encompasses all the educational institutions.
But it doesn't contain them, because we know that
No,
they
it
can
doesn't.
step outside of that zone
Yes.
anytime and
But
acquire
I mean,
land.
the one
as can the
piece
library.
way off to the west, that's the SAU. You
Is
know,
it? I wondered that. Okay.
Yeah, and then along the river, I think that there's Plymouth Village Water and Sewer has easements and rights of way and
Okay.
infrastructure in there. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it's on the other side of the Baker River,
Yeah.
and at the confluence there with the Pemmy is where the wells are, and that's Water and Sewer District. So, you know, this is what I'm saying. They drew the zones around what they saw on the ground.
And we're revisiting it now, so it's a fresh opportunity.
And is there anything that's really like not working because of the way things are zoned right now?
That's what we're asking.
Yeah, and so I think that's another good way to approach it. Is there something in here that just really is creating a problem, or we could conceive that it would be a problem? You know, we could foresee that.
The only thing as a layperson, and I don't know a lot about planning, you know, as a layperson, as a landowner, when I look at that, I'm like, I want to straighten the lines. I want to put that little pink purpley zone, and why not put it with the village district? You know, that's
You're
just-
trying to get some kind of order out of this whole thing?
maybe, well, right, because
Right.
people want to understand, maybe people want to understand how things are zoned and why.
May I make a
I mean,
suggestion that might help us through the whole process?
Sure.
The whole intent of zoning is to mitigate sight, sound, smell, ground vibration, groundwater quality, and safety. Every one of our zones is written to address those issues. What we don't have, and the citizens don't have, is a definition of each one of those sensory perception skill sets. If you can't talk about why is it I like the single-family residential zone? What is the key item for the quality of living in my house in a single-family zone? The predominant one is sound, okay, noise reduction. The second one is sight. They want something that looks nice and pleasing when you step out your door. The other one is ground vibration, which is a sleeper. People don't realize it, but that's why we don't have heavy truck traffic through the residential area. It doesn't make a lot of noise, but it'll put a 7 to 14 frequencies in the ground that will wake up your cats, your dogs, and your babies. So a lot of towns have an ordinance that you can't do anything before 7 o'clock in the morning. It requires
I
traps.
think what you're sharing, though, is important because that could become the basis for those purposes.
So when you're looking at the values of each one of the zones and the uses, is the fact that it has different levels of every one of those. Now, in a village commercial zone, we expect traffic, we expect noise, we expect unique smells, like when someone's roasting their coffee beans. And
Lighting.
so all of those elements have different levels of tolerance. And so each one of those issues, and the final one is safety. Obviously, when you have a high-density area such as the downtown area, there are a lot of rules, regulations, codes, and standards that deal with safety.
So let me just try something really quickly, because I know we don't have a lot of time left. When you talk about these things, Frank, does it concern you to move the boundaries of the civic, institutional / village district?
It represents part of the
Or you
rationale of a zone label, and a boundary is somewhere along the lines, people have said the activity in that zone represents either a visual, a smell, a sight, whatever, and we want to not have this in this zone.
But some of the activity levels and some of those characteristics are the same in
That's
both
correct.
those two.
And so that's where you're allowed a special exception, or you might get a variance for it, because you have been able to prove the fact that you are not going to impact those 6 items of quality of living that we, the people of town of
Okay.
Plymouth, have said why we want zoning.
Okay. Thanks for that, this sort of background.
For civic and institutional, should we pause until we've done the homework, as Frank suggested? Because I think this is nice to do, and even at the end of it, if we decide it stays the way it is, that would be good. We'd know why we got there.
So to study up on what the definition is as it is,
Yeah, what uses are allowed,
what uses are
what
allowed.
uses exist, really think about the character of that district and its boundaries. It gives us a nice linear way to look at it.
It's also, this is the part we need to address with the citizens when they are going to vote for this. You need to get that support and concurrence that this work is correct, and we, the people of town of Plymouth, want to see this happen. They're voting their feelings, and if you can't connect this plan and these words of these elements to their feelings, they'll maybe not concur with it and not vote for it. So
Well,
that's
and they have to be able to read it in a summary form.
correct.
They're just not going to read a single sheet.
And I think the other thing we're doing here, I think you purposely did this, we're starting with the districts that probably are going to change the least and are probably it's fine tuning, and it's probably, these are the most difficult to really try to figure out the
Right.
little, as opposed to, I think when we get to agricultural zone, I think there's a lot of things in there that we know we could change for the better. I mean, that's a very different animal than these things.
And the good news when we get to that one is we can fall back on the future land use plan as shown in the master plan. We can fall back on the natural resource inventory. We're going to have, as Frank pointed out with civic and institutional, we're going to have some of this homework to do in that district to say, is it all the same? Are there reasons why some areas are different? Do they become sub-districts? Do they become distinctly different districts? It's not easy work, but it'll be important work.
And to kind of get back to something that Bridget pointed out, was what we're dealing with here is one item in that giant master plan. However, I think it really isn't, particularly when we get to the agricultural zone. We'll find out that a lot of these things are connected. And that is one of my worries, is that if we only focus on this part of the master plan, and I know so I have a little suggestion too, but if we only focus on this, we're going to miss a lot of those other items that we could, some of us could be working on these other things simultaneously, and that doesn't seem to be happening right now.
We've talked about it at 2 meetings now that we could do that.
You talked about like low-hanging fruit, getting little
Right.
things off.
And I've been sending Rebecca, as I go through the master plan, and I CC'd you on the last ones.
Okay.
I think those things we could be working on simultaneously, and I also think with this, and I may be totally wrong here, and no one else might agree with this, but it seems to me that, say, you and Grace seem very interested in doing this, that a lot of this work you guys could do and just present to us your findings and get sort of approval, so we don't have to go through as much work in these work sessions. I think that it seems like a lot of this stuff, particularly because, and, Steve, you do know a lot more about this than any of us.
To be fully transparent, if that happens, there'll be more conspiracy theories about how new zoning was written, and I'm not going to put myself in that position. Right? So I would rather do it out here in the public where it's televised and people can go back and look through this, and they
And you
can
think
see.
even coming in and just giving us sort of a summary, a public summary of.
Anybody with a strong opinion is seen as having an agenda.
What if we, what if you bit off just little pieces and did a half an hour per month, or I don't know, like maybe there's
For the low-hanging fruit or for this?
this.
Either. You could do it for both. You could do a half hour for each. I do think putting limits on it is reasonable. Because we've spent now, an hour? Which we got a lot done, actually. We got through,
Yeah, this is
we
great.
scratched the surface on 3 districts.
And I don't mind being here for, we can, according to the bylaws, we can stay here till 10, unless we decide, what's that?
Try it.
Yeah. But, we budgeted that much time. And I don't mind doing it. I'm just trying to think of ways to maybe efficiently speed it up, and so some of us could be working on other things that we may have a little more expertise, or at least multitask and be able to do some of this other stuff too.
At the end of the day, the majority of people that come before this board are influenced by this document. And its user-friendliness and the regulations they have to meet. So it's a huge piece, and we couldn't really revisit the zoning until we had updated the master plan. And so the timing for it's perfect, but I don't think it has to be the only thing we're working on.
To be honest, Chris, we've been talking about zoning rewrite for the past 10 years.
And I just am struck by, basically, the master plan that we have is the exact same master plan that came out 10 years ago. If you look at the old master plan, it's like the same stuff. It's weird. So I just wonder, I just want to make sure we get through some of those other items. So in 10 more, would you not agree? Grab the old master plan and look at it. It's
Yeah, they're
basically
very,
the same
very,
thing.
very
And we spent a
similar.
lot of time, or at least the implementation items. And there's no reason for that, because some of those things we could knock off. Just the other day, it has to come up, we have to discuss it in public. But, like the Class 6 road thing, some of those things are just no-brainers. They just should be taken out of there. So I just worry that that isn't going to be getting done also. And I don't see any reason that we can't multitask and do all these things at once.
I think in your minutes, though, from last time, it was reflected, Rebecca Hanson said that we have to keep it at the planning board level, the zoning conversation. And I don't know if it happens like in a smaller subcommittee, or maybe you can help with that, Brian, or just once a month, or But I recall that in the minutes that Rebecca thought it had to happen,
Yeah, because of the transparency laws.
which is what, yep.
Well, I mean, aside from that, but I mean, the actual laws, if they spun off a subcommittee, you would be subject to the same rules as this one is.
Got it.
So it's notice requirements,
Sure.
it's better to keep it as informal as one can, because it essentially speeds the process. And then there's always you get the group that's going over there, they come back with something, it needs to be discussed with the full board. You're actually, while, speeding one thing, you're slowing it down with the other hand. So if it could all be accomplished, in a group setting with all the players there, it actually goes a little further. And I do agree with what Chris says, though. I think that maybe, devote some time at the public hearing sessions. Because, for example, the next one we have is one case. And I know a lot of people like, a light night, which is good. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't spend 20 minutes on implementation, and still get out at a very, very reasonable hour.
And just one more thing that I would point out is some of these implementation items, we're not going to be able to do them sitting in this room because they involve going out in the field and doing some research. So I don't know how those things are handled, and I just think identify, parking issue, identify places to park, identify a park and ride. I mean, those type of things are in here. And, at some point, we're probably going to have to get out in the field and do some of this stuff. So I'm just pointing that out.
Can we wait till it gets warmer?
Thank you.
Before we, just so we can wrap up what we've
Yeah.
done tonight, can I get some clarity on next steps? So we looked at initial conversations on 3 districts. I'm willing to create a template and put in the information I have from these notes into 3 drafts, so we start going. And then there'll be a placeholder for a purpose statement. The name of the district can get changed in the future if we need to. But to start to put in, and maybe even put in the use standards as they exist and the dimensional standards as they exist.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
And just to give you a visual.
Should have brought the table of uses, it would have aided this
And
conversation.
it's sort of getting back to what
Is that
Frank
in
said,
the
that some of this is already out there.
Yeah, it's in zoning.
Yeah, so I have them here somewhere.
Just to give you a visual, so I showed this to Grace. So we've done this for the city of Dover. So in the city of Dover, when you are in a specific sub-district in the downtown, you get this sheet. Tells you everything you need to know.
Oh, wow.
And on the backside, it has the architectural requirements and the streetscape requirements. But basically, your dimensional regulations, your permitted use, the statement of purpose, little references to where to look in the zoning if you need more perspective, but building placement, that type of stuff. Some of this won't relate for us, but at the very least, the title of the district, the statement of purpose, the dimensional regulations, the permitted uses can be on. And then we can compare them against other districts. We can make changes as we need to. So this is the type of thing I'm willing to do for this process so that we can use it going forward, just to keep
I
track.
think that would make it go faster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do too.
That's my hope.
So the other thing you guys are gonna do is to review, so are we doing next step stuff?
Yeah.
Just for civic,
What's that?
just for the civic, this,
I think initially, yeah. That was the one that there was more questions on.
that part of our next steps,
Sure.
homework?
I think we should do that. The civic and institutional comparison you suggested, I think we should do
Yeah,
that.
and then what you want to gel down is the most restrictive difference. In other words, why you limits that zone to the next less or more restrictive zone.
Okay. Does it make sense with these templates if there's enough information in the master plan to pull together some sentences, the start of a purpose statement, that we put it in there? I don't want to craft anything on my own yet, but if I can find language that we already crafted as a planning board and adopted, I'm happy to go in and copy and paste it in. Just to start to, so if we read it and we say, that's not what that district should be about, at least we know that we all agree that we're going in the wrong direction.
Right.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that
I
sounds
mean,
good.
that's just another fact sheet.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
And then,
that's sort of a homeworky thing.
and then the next meeting is the first Thursday in April, correct? Next work session
Yes,
for these. So that's April what?
right.
Four.
April 4th, yeah. Yep.
I don't think I'm going to be here. I'm going to be in Canada. But would you still be here to facilitate?
I'd have to look at my calendar. I don't have anything.
Okay.
I'm happy to if it works, if it's helping.
And Rebecca will be back as well, so she could also. But I think we need to continue to work on the next, and do another district or two, if possible. And I just have to be away for work. But
How's that sound? I mean, was this helpful tonight? Does it? I know there are concerns about what about the rest of the master plan and all the other to-do items. I mean, you could spend a certain amount of time on
Right.
that.
I think the people to ask, was it helpful, is you guys. I mean, was this helpful to you?
this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the last thing I want to do, to be perfectly honest, because this is what I do all my other nights out. But I think it's really important, so I'm willing to do it.
I think you actually got more accomplished than I thought you were going to tonight.
I think we did too. Yeah. So
So I think it was
Is to
helpful.
prioritize, if we have all of these different potential work zones, is to prioritize which one we get the best return on investment for our time, money, and effort spent on. And that would, to me, would be the village commercial downtown area, okay? That's the one that has the best return on investment for trying to make the necessary changes that we'd like to see from a master plan. The other zones are there, but the downtown priority-wise, I think, is the area where the most frustrations and conflicts of use and interaction between people is occurring, and that's where most of our complaints are at. And I think that's...
So Frank, maybe the next meeting, you can point some, because I think that's what we need to hear. What are these conflicts? What are these complaints, right? I mean, that's, and
as long as they're related to the zoning, because we just don't want to get too far out.
Exactly. So if you have specific, if you have knowledge of that, I think that would really speed things up. If we knew what the problems were with, because I really don't know what the problems are with the village commercial zone so much.
Well, I mean, I could tell you right now, I think we have two different patterns. We have here, kind of in the core, around the common and up to the roundabout, and then we have South Main Street. And
Yeah.
that's more auto-oriented, parking lots in front of buildings. It's a very different beast.
Yes.
And we need to decide what's the pattern we want to encourage in the zoning and how can we try to minimize those conflicts.
Correct.
So, and we won't do that in one meeting or two.
And I don't think it'll be really apparent until we look at them all.
I think you're right.
My methodology is first do the inventory.
Yep.
I did the inventory of the parking in 1990 for the Main Street program. It needs to be reevaluated and re-inventoried, and when the snow melts and you can see land, I will do that. And also, I inventoried the businesses on Main Street, so-called. At the time, it was 115 businesses on Main Street. There's a whole methodology of how our infrastructure works with that type of business, but we need to get an update on that inventory.
But there are also other ways of looking at it, and one of the ways in urban locations now is to have a zero parking requirement. And
Well,
we're in that situation, and then the market provides the parking
We-
because people want the
Well,
density.
In
let's
order
be
to-
careful about getting into the devil of the details
In order
tonight.
to talk about what things we could do in the future, you have to have a baseline of knowledge of existing what you have.
Which is essentially what we're doing now.
Yeah, that's what we're doing.
And the master plan inventory, yeah.
I mean, if you can write those out, if you're gonna come,
got
you could write them and we could just hand them out and everybody can read them. That would,
So I actually, going back to your question or point, you know, Rebecca had assigned us at the last meeting to take a look at the implementation section and sort of decide on a section that you felt you could be an expert on. I wonder if a different approach might be to scan it for items that you think you might have a solution for
Yes.
and come in with an idea, and we could spend 20 minutes of each work session, just kind of shouting out our, I found one I think we could do easily, and it's this, and
I love it.
I didn't like, no particular area struck me.
Yeah, and
But, we might get more momentum from coming in with a solution or a suggestion about a particular
Plus, it's been
item.
real broad overviews in the development of it. So now if you go back and you look at, just pick a implementation chapter at random, say, read through it with what you've learned, what we talked about, and maybe, boink, there's the idea, so, obviously you
thought.
would start with the things you're familiar with, but I think
sounds
that's a
more
good
fun.
idea.
Yeah, but
I thought it
are we
sounded
worried that we're gonna
hilarious.
miss things, so this particular item in the implementation also affects so it affects, economic development and it affects zoning, but if you're only focused on one, you're not gonna see the other. I'm not sure how you fix that or address that or look at it in a different way.
if you spend time with that implementation section, I mean, there's certain things that you like, short-term goals and ongoing things immediately should be looked at, because some of those things can just be taken care of. I think your idea is a good one, Bridget. I think it would be best to have a clearinghouse, for us to be sending those things as we notice them to Rebecca, and then she can put them on the agenda. I think would work best, rather than have everybody, just, kind of vying
Yeah,
to.
because you might have overlap.
Yeah, we'd have yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to my mind is a community calendar. We have a webmaster, right?
Kind of.
Kind of. See
I
these,
mean, we have access to put things up on the website,
Yeah.
and they'll put it in, they're real good. You can give them the rough stuff, and they'll make it look pretty for us.
seems like
too.
we could make that could be something that could be done pretty easily, and anybody could submit there, so that people interested in coming to visit the town could find this great, here's what's going on in Plymouth. For example.
So you guys are pretty much.
We're good.
This is what we got next time.
Yep.
Any public comments? Quick ones.
No, that's.
No? Nobody? Anyone want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
I'll second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you, Steve and Grace.